Have you ever wondered what would have happened if the Cold War turned hot? Imagine a world where the ideological battle between capitalism and communism escalated into a full-blown military conflict. That's the chilling reality the world faced for nearly half a century, from 1945 to 1991 in a standoff known as the Cold War. This was a war where the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, never directly engaged in battle. Yet, the tension was palpable, the stakes high, and the threats real. This was an unseen war, fought not on battlegrounds but in political arenas, through economic strategies, and with the ever-looming shadow of nuclear weapons. This conflict wasn't just about two nations, it was a global chess match that shaped the world as we know it today, influencing politics, technology, and culture in ways we still feel. Now, journey back in time as we delve into the events of the Cold War. In 1945, World War II ended, but a new conflict was just beginning. This was not a conventional war fought with tanks and soldiers, but a war of ideologies, a Cold War. In the early years of the Cold War, the world's superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, were trying to shape the post-war world in their image. The first major sites of this ideological struggle were the Yalta and Potsdam conferences. Here, the leaders of these superpowers met to determine the fate of Europe. With the memory of the war still fresh, they strategized, negotiated, and in some instances, clashed over spheres of influence and the future political order. While the Yalta Conference was somewhat cooperative, the Potsdam Conference was a different story. The mood had shifted. The ideological differences between the democratic West and the communist East became glaringly obvious, and the conference ended with a sense of unease. The Iron Curtain, a term coined by Winston Churchill, symbolized this divide. It referred to the metaphorical barrier separating the democratic West and the communist East. It was a line drawn across Europe, marking a clear division between two vastly different political, economic, and social systems. In the face of this growing divide, the United States launched the Marshall Plan. Named after Secretary of State George Marshall, this economic aid package aimed to rebuild war-torn Europe. It was a tool of soft power designed to win hearts and minds, to strengthen democracies, and to contain the spread of communism. The early years of the Cold War were characterized by deep mistrust, ideological clashes, and strategic maneuvering. This was the dawn of an era where the world was no longer united against a common enemy, but was fractured along ideological lines. The world was dividing into two opposing blocs, setting the stage for a long and tense conflict. The 1950s brought an intensification of the Cold War. As the decade dawned, the world found itself on the precipice of a new kind of conflict, one that would be fought not on traditional battlefields, but in the minds and hearts of people around the globe. This was a conflict characterized by ideological divide, nuclear anxiety, and a desperate race for technological superiority. The Korean War erupted in the early 50s, becoming a focal point of this ideological struggle. As North and South Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and the United States respectively, fought a brutal war, the world watched with bated breath. This was no longer simply about Korea, it was a proxy war, a stark manifestation of the East-West divide that was the Cold War. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the Red Scare was in full swing. Fear of communist infiltration gripped the nation. The government, led by the likes of Senator Joseph McCarthy, pursued an aggressive campaign against alleged communists within its ranks. This climate of fear and suspicion only further polarized the American public, fueling the flames of the Cold War. While the world was grappling with the realities of this new kind of war, another battle was being waged high above the Earth's surface. The space race had begun. The Soviet Union and the United States were locked in a fierce competition to conquer the final frontier. Each new launch, each new achievement, was a testament to their technological prowess and a symbol of their ideological superiority. When the Soviet Union launched the first man-made satellite, Sputnik, in 1957, it was a clear indication that the stakes had been raised. As the decade came to a close, it was clear that the Cold War was not just a passing phase. It had permeated every aspect of global politics, shaping alliances, fueling conflicts, and defining the world order. By the end of the 1950s, the Cold War had become a defining feature of global politics. The 1960s were marked by some of the most dramatic events of the Cold War. This decade saw the world come perilously close to full-scale nuclear war, a prospect that made the Cold War more than just a battle of ideologies. It became a struggle for survival. Let's take a look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. In October of 1962, American spy planes discovered Soviet missile bases being built in Cuba, just 90 miles off the U.S. coast. For 13 nerve-wracking days, the world held its breath as the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, stood on the brink of nuclear war. It was a game of high-stakes diplomacy, with each side trying to outmaneuver the other without triggering a war that could obliterate civilization. But the Cuban Missile Crisis was not the only flashpoint of the decade. Over in Southeast Asia, the Vietnam War was escalating. This conflict was a proxy war, where the United States and the Soviet Union fought not directly, but through their respective allies. The war in Vietnam was a brutal and protracted conflict, and it deeply divided the American public, leading to widespread protests and civil unrest. Back in Europe, another symbol of the Cold War was taking shape. In 1961, the East German government, backed by the Soviet Union, began the construction of the Berlin Wall. This concrete barrier, stretching over 100 miles, became a stark symbol of the divide between East and West. It was a physical manifestation of the ideological battle that was the Cold War, a wall that divided families, friends, and a nation. The 1960s were a decade of heightened tensions, of standoffs and conflicts that threatened to spiral into a full-scale war. The world watched in fear and anticipation as the two superpowers locked horns, each trying to assert its dominance without triggering a nuclear apocalypse. The world was teetering on the edge of nuclear catastrophe. The 1970s ushered in a period of détente, a thawing of Cold War tensions. As the decade dawned, the world breathed a collective sigh of relief. The standoff between the superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, seemed to be easing. This era of détente was marked by a series of significant events that suggested a shift in the dynamics of the Cold War. Perhaps the most notable among these was the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT. These negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union aimed to curb the arms race that had escalated throughout the Cold War. The first SALT Treaty, signed in 1972, limited the deployment of anti-ballistic missile systems and placed restrictions on the number of strategic offensive weapons each side could possess. This was an unprecedented move towards cooperation and a stark departure from the rampant nuclear proliferation of the previous decades. Around the same time, another crucial event unfolded. The Helsinki Accords, signed in 1975, marked a significant diplomatic achievement. The accords were a declaration of human rights, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, signed by 35 nations, including the US and the Soviet Union. This was a clear indication that the superpowers were moving towards a mutual understanding. Finally, the end of the Vietnam War in 1975 also played a role in easing tensions. The war had been a significant source of conflict between the US and the Soviet Union, with each supporting opposing sides. Its conclusion signaled an end to one of the most contentious chapters of the Cold War. But as history would have it, this period of détente was not to last. The late 1970s saw renewed tensions and a return to the adversarial relationship between the US and the Soviet Union. The arms race resumed, and the ideological battle intensified. Despite temporary relief, the Cold War was far from over. The stage was set for the final act, a dramatic conclusion to a conflict that had held the world in its grip for decades. The 1980s marked the final years of the Cold War. A decade that began with heightened tensions, with the world teetering on the edge of nuclear catastrophe, slowly transformed into a time of reconciliation and eventual peace. The early 80s saw a significant escalation of the Cold War under President Ronald Reagan. His administration took a hardline stance against the Soviet Union, ramping up military spending and adopting a more confrontational rhetoric. Reagan's fiery speeches, filled with terms like evil empire, further strained the already taut relationship between the two superpowers. In the middle of the decade, Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a program aimed at developing a sophisticated anti-ballistic missile system. This initiative, often referred to as Star Wars, was seen as a game changer, a shift from the policy of mutually assured destruction towards one of defense. However, it also raised fears of a renewed arms race. While the world braced for a more intense standoff, change was brewing within the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev, who came to power in 1985, pursued policies of openness and economic restructuring, known as glasnost and perestroika. These reforms, aimed at revitalizing the Soviet economy, inadvertently led to a surge of nationalist movements within the Soviet republics, challenging the very fabric of the Union. The late 80s were marked by a series of historic events that signaled the end of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall, a symbol of division for nearly 3 decades, was brought down in 1989. The Iron Curtain was lifting, paving the way for a wave of democratic transitions across Eastern Europe. By 1991, the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse. Internal pressures, economic troubles, and the rising tide of nationalism had weakened the once mighty empire. In December, the hammer and sickle flag was lowered for the last time over the Kremlin, marking the end of an era. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, marking the end of the Cold War. The world had changed, and the balance of power had shifted, leaving a legacy that continues to shape global politics to this day. The end of the Cold War left an indelible mark on the world. This period of geopolitical tension that had spanned over 4 decades, with the United States and the Soviet Union at its epicenter, had finally come to an end. This cessation didn't just signify the end of a conflict, but it marked the dawn of a new world order. The United States emerged not just victorious, but as the world's sole superpower. This new status granted the nation an unprecedented global influence, shaping international politics, economics, and culture. On the other hand, the Soviet Union, once a titan of global influence, crumbled. The dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the end of an era. 15 new countries emerged from the ashes, each carrying the weight of their Soviet past, while striving to forge their own futures. The aftermath of the Cold War also brought a significant shift in international relations. The bipolar world that had been dominated by 2 superpowers was no more. Countries now had to navigate a unipolar world where the United States held most of the cards. This shift affected not just the political landscape, but also had profound implications on global economics, security, and culture. Furthermore, the Cold War left its mark on every continent. From the Berlin Wall in Europe to the Korean Peninsula in Asia, from the Cuban Missile Crisis in the Americas to the proxy wars in Africa and the Middle East, the echoes of this conflict can still be heard today. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Cold War is the lesson it taught us about the potential for catastrophic consequences when 2 superpowers clash. It's a stark reminder of the delicate balance of power and the necessity for diplomacy and dialogue over aggression and brinkmanship. The Cold War, a conflict like no other, left a legacy that continues to shape the world. Looking back, the Cold War was a complex and multifaceted conflict. It was a chess game between 2 superpowers, played out on a global stage, where each move was calculated and every piece held significance. It was an era of political maneuvering, espionage, propaganda, and proxy wars, a time when the world held its breath, balanced on the edge of a nuclear precipice. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the world was divided into 2 ideological camps: the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the communist East, led by the Soviet Union. This division set the stage for a confrontation that would span nearly 5 decades. From the Iron Curtain descending across Europe to the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin Wall to the space race, the Cold War was a period of intense tension and competition. Yet, it was also a time of significant change and progress. The Cold War spurred technological advancements, from the development of the Internet to the landing of the first human on the moon. It shaped global politics, influencing the formation of alliances and the emergence of new nations. It spurred social changes, inspiring movements for civil rights, gender equality, and environmental protection. The Cold War also taught the world valuable lessons about the dangers of ideological extremism and the importance of diplomatic dialogue. It highlighted the need for cooperation and mutual respect among nations, a principle that continues to guide international relations to this day. The Cold War ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the end of this era. Yet the effects of the Cold War continue to ripple through time, influencing our present and future. So, next time you ponder on the question, what if the Cold War turned hot? Remember the history we have shared today. The Cold War remains a pivotal chapter in our global story. Its echoes still heard in today's world politics.